Chapter 9. The Boss Boomers. The problem with boss boomers is they weren't optional. You didn't have to see a psychology boomer if you didn't want to. You could avoid professor boomers by majoring in STEM or simply ignoring what they said. Feminist boomers you could largely do the same. Even teacher boomers could be avoided through homeschooling or getting a GED at 15. But if you wanted to eat or pay rent, it was guaranteed you'd have to deal with a boss boomer. And since everyone needed to eat, millennials and Gen Xers were doomed to ram heads with boss boomers. This set the stage for a clash between an unstoppable force and an immovable object. On the unstoppable force side, you had Gen X and the millennials, whose main motivation was simple survival. Though not experienced, they were hungry. They were starving. They had been cooped up for 17 years in the education industry and just wanted out. Plus, they were desperate to start paying off their loans, make some money, maybe even dare to live life a little bit. Their entire childhood had been invested into this moment, and like horses at the racetrack, they were just waiting for the gates to open. On the immovable object side, you had the boss boomers. They were cut from the same low-grade inferior cloth the aforementioned boomers were. They were also largely motivated by self-love, laziness, profit, and politics, like their boomer colleagues. But what made them immovable was two traits they held above all other boomers: incompetence and stubbornness. This made them impervious to change, but also blinded them to opportunities, as well as threats, which would inevitably lead to their downfall. This also made them tone-deaf and clueless. You'd have a better chance of getting the Rock of Gibraltar to pirouette than getting a boss boomer to hear out an idea, adapt new technology, or simply recognize reality. Therefore, no matter how hungry Gen X and millennials were, they were going to run headlong into this thicket of boss boomer incompetence. And this incompetence would obstruct, bog down, and drain the millennials and Gen Xers, guaranteeing they would never reach their full career potential. It would also render traditional employment obsolete, because the working environment boss boomers would force upon millennials and Xers would simply be unacceptable. It would be full of contradictory orders, a lack of training, a lack of leadership, gross ethical, moral, and legal violations, and sometimes outright sadism. In short, the incompetence, stubbornness, and ineptitude of boss boomers would make it impossible to work for them. And they would make it impossible on 4 fronts. They would make it impossible to get a job, they would make it impossible to do the job, they would make it impossible to endure the environment, and they would eliminate meritocracy from the job. In short, they would make it impossible for millennials and Gen Xers to earn a living, arguably making the boss boomers the most damaging boomers in their lives. Impossible to get the job. In terms of making it impossible to get the job, boss boomers threw up more hurdles than Hitler did on Omaha Beach, the largest of which easily being progressive credentialism. Progressive credentialism. Progressive credentialism is simply an educational arms race where you need perpetually more and more education to get the same job. In 1920, all you needed was a 6th grade education to get a job. In 1950, you needed a high school diploma. By 1970, you really needed an associate's degree. And today, you need a bachelor's degree just to get an entry-level position. And of course, whoever came up with the phrase "master's preferred" should be hunted down, dragged out into the street, and shot twice. But the true insult of progressive credentialism is not so much perpetually moving the goalposts when it came to education, but when you finally landed a job, got to work, and found out it was a job you could have easily done with a 6th grade education. Be it office work, an analyst gig, retail, or account management, nearly 80% of jobs that required a bachelor's degree could have been done with a 6th grade education. Thus, in requiring a college degree for all jobs, boss boomers forced an unnecessary decade of additional education, that is, 7th grade through college, and $40,000 in tuition on 2 generations of young Americans. When you consider the 50 million college students who needlessly attend college, this is multiple trillions of dollars and $500 billion years of human lives lost that could have easily been invested elsewhere, such as a house, stocks, working, raising a family, or just plain goofing around. The real kick in the teeth, however, is the reason the boss boomers unnecessarily insisted on college degrees for 6th grade level jobs. It made sifting through resumes easier. Instead of taking the time to read a resume, see if a candidate had the competency and work experience necessary to do the job, boss boomers made 2 full generations of youth get bachelor's degrees, all so they could more easily sift through their resumes, throwing those without college degrees into the dustbin. In other words, employers unloaded their employee searching costs on young college students. But instead of the token amount of extra time it would have taken their HR departments to read through resumes, they handed the price tag of $2 trillion and $500 billion human years to millennials and Gen Xers. Just remember that the next time you hear your boss boomer talk about corporate social responsibility and work-life balance. Unrealistic job qualifications. Another impossible hurdle boss boomers put up in front of millennials was requiring impossible qualifications to get jobs. The quintessential example of this is posting an entry-level job, but requiring 3 to 5 years experience, thus behooving the question from starving millennials and Gen Xers, how am I supposed to get experience if all the entry-level jobs require experience? There were other examples of impossible requirements, such as requiring 3 years experience in a software that had only been out 1 year, true story, requiring 10 years experience but with entry-level pay, and, of course, requiring advanced degrees when none would ever be needed. Thankfully, these jobs never got filled because it was impossible to fill them, but it still doesn't mean millions in human hours weren't wasted trying. Human resources. Then there is human resources, or HR. There's a special level of hell for child molesters, people who talk in the theater, and the guy who thought it would be a great idea to outsource all hiring decisions to HR. Not only because it didn't work, but because dealing with HR was the most maddening and insulting experience as a job applicant. The idea was that boss boomers were too busy to actually conduct their own employee search. So why not outsource this mundane and unimportant task, while at the same time claiming employees are our best asset, to a bunch of incompetent 24-year-old ditzes who knew nothing about the job, profession, or industry. This not only resulted in the impossible job postings described above, but a guarantee that the most qualified individual would not get the job. And so, not knowing anything about the specific job and its requirements, HR would ask witchcraft-like questions about, if you were an animal, which one would it be and why? What's your favorite color and why? Have you ever had a problem with your boss, and how did you solve it? How do you engage in the community outside work? Meanwhile, millions of engineering, CPA, welding, and other real professional candidates sat there with their mouths agape, wondering why in hell's name they were being interviewed by such idiots. The real problem with HR was that their methods were intangible, amorphous, and unproven. And so, even though you could have been the most qualified candidate for the job, you wouldn't even make it past the first round of interviews, because the HR dits didn't like your shoes, didn't like your gait, or perhaps didn't like the fact that the elephant was your favorite animal. The good news is HR has largely been moved from interviews to employment law, compliance, and benefits/compensation. But there were at least 2 generations of qualified millennials and Gen Xers who didn't get the job they deserved because they were being insulted by the world's dumbest interviewers. Networking. It wouldn't take the intrepid millennials or Gen Xers long to realize that HR was an impossible den of bureaucratic stupid, the path through which would never land them a job. An alternative path to employment had to be found because, well, you kinda needed to eat that month. But boss boomers and professor boomers had a solution that was the universal solution they'd give to everyone. Networking. You see, all those years you spent in K-12 education and the additional 4 years you spent in college wasn't enough to land a job. And the fact that you had a 3.8 GPA with an internship under your belt and taught yourself the program that companies were seeking didn't matter. What really mattered was connections. That it wasn't what you know, but who you know. You needed to develop your soft personal skills. And if you went to industry events and job fairs, hobnobbed with recruiters or boss boomers, all while wearing a schmucky suit with a stack of paper resumes in hand, then you might get in with the elusive hiring manager, and he would help you bypass HR. And so there you went. Off to the job circus or the recruitment festival, replete with a stack of paper resumes in hand, adorned in a schmucky suit, looking around with a dopey look on your face. Being reminded this was more like picking up a girl at a nightclub than anything that would resemble a meritocratic way to find employment. But though you may have been a naive 22-year-old, your original observations were correct. Networking was BS. Networking was a joke. It wasn't meritocratic. It was degrading. It was stupid. It was a waste of time. And above all else, it was merely kissing ass, and boss boomers loved every second of it. Landing a job at a job fair was the exception, not the rule. It was just as much a waste of time as interviewing with HR. Thankfully, because of the internet, Gen Z will never have to endure the degrading, ass-kissing waste of time that was networking. They can merely upload their resumes, applying for 20 positions in the time it would take them to apply for 3 at a job fair. and they can certainly leave their schmucky suits at home. But like the insulting and pointless experience it was being interviewed by HR, millions of millennials and Gen Xers also remember the equally insulting and pointless experience that networking was. Precious time and resources wasted on something that would never land them a job. Rescending job offers. Finally, the last way boomers would make it impossible to find a job would be to offer you a job and then rescind the job offer. This would manifest itself in a variety of hilarious ways. You would have a great interview, they would say you're the best candidate, and they would say they'd contact you in a week. But after the second week passed and you put in a few calls, you'd slowly realized you weren't getting the job. You might actually get the job offer with an actual letter in the mail. But immediately following that, you either get another letter in the mail or a call from HR rescinding the offer. And then there's the old classic where they give you a job offer, you have a start date, but when you show up for work, nobody knows who you are or why you're there, because in reality, the company is so poorly managed they never told you the job had been reneged. These experiences were particularly disheartening as they built your hopes up, only to pull the rug out from underneath, with that added special sting that your survival depended on it. But despicable as this was, millions of millennials and Gen Xers will never forget the boss boomers who did this to them and made it so hard to survive. Impossible to do the job. Despite the obstacles boss boomers created to employment, inevitably you'd get one past the goalie, you'd get through the flak, and you'd finally land yourself a job. Hunger, poverty, student debts, and starvation were surprisingly powerful engines of millennial and Gen Xer perseverance. But the truth is, companies can't run without employees, so boss boomers would invariably have to hire some people, albeit begrudgingly. But before you get too excited and breathe a sigh of relief, maybe even celebrate your new job by buying something nice, the honeymoon period would quickly end, as you realized just what a shit show your boomer bosses were running. Lying about your job duties. First, you'd immediately find out most boss boomers would lie about your job duties, starting with your title. You were not a manager, you were not an analyst, you were not a specialist. You were a low-grade data entrysman, filer, or some other clerical job you could have done at the age of 12. You would also find out that ad hoc meant all the crap work we didn't want to do, which will also make up 75% of the job duties instead of the 25% we listed on the job description. Soon you're not working on cars or fixing diesel engines, you're running the used oil to the recycling center, watching your skills decay. There is not one boomer boss alive today who has ever written a completely honest and accurate job description, or assigned it an equally accurate job title. Constantly changing your job. Second, you would find out that your job would constantly change, with new and unagreed upon duties. Some of this is to be expected because no job is 100% static, but boss boomers would have no problems assigning you tasks that had nothing to do with either your education, training, or what you had originally signed up for in the first place. And it was guaranteed these new duties were lesser, unprestigious ones. They did not enhance your resume, build your skills, or even improve you as an employee. They just made you an assistant to your boss, not a skilled professional. Eliminating training programs. Third, it was, and still is, against the law for boss boomers to ever give their employees training, either for the job they were ostensibly hired to do, or the ones they actually ended up doing. This is because of the Don't Want to Train Our Employees Act of 1983, which made it illegal for boss boomers to train employees and outlawed any company from offering training programs. Instead, boss boomers would replace training programs with sayings such as, must hit the ground running, steep learning curve, need a self-starter, and I don't have time to hold your hand. This, combined with a mandatory bachelor's degree, though master's preferred of course, would supplant training and training programs across the country. Joking aside, the real reason boss boomers never provided training, guidance, or leadership was because of the same reason they forced 2 generations of youth to get unnecessary college degrees. They were lazy. Just as boss boomers were too lazy to look through resumes and find a qualified employee, they were also too lazy to do something as basic as provide training. So instead of a company spending 2 weeks and maybe $1,000 to fund a training program, they were only more than happy to force millennials to spend 4 years and $50,000 on a college degree, while they yelled at you, steep learning curve. Once again, if boss boomers just had the common sense and simple morality to put together training programs, they could have spared 50 million millennials and Gen Xers the cost of attending college, while training them specifically for a job, resulting in better employees. But it's debatable as to whether boomers hated training programs or nuclear families more. No tools to do the job. Fourth, just as it's against the law for boss boomers to give you training, it's also against the law for them to give you the resources you need to do your job. Though many people have many stories, I was reminded of an actuarial client who had to run regression models, churning through thousands of data points and millions of calculations. His boss boomers wouldn't give him a computer with the processing power required to crunch those numbers. So, instead of the 4 minutes an actuarial computer would take, his computer took 4 hours to do the same. Despite repeated explanations and requests for a better computer, his boss boomers simply didn't understand reality. The computer they gave him could not operate any faster, and there was literally nothing in the known physical universe that would make those calculations go faster than a more powerful computer. But, of course, this fact didn't prevent his boss boomers from lecturing him and reprimanding him for taking too long to do the calculations. But be it a more powerful computer or better equipment, boss boomers are notorious for simply not giving you the overall resources you need to do your job. It could be the information you need, a report, physical equipment, funding, data, even something as simple as approval. Boss boomers never give you all the pieces you need to get the job done, once again making it impossible to work for them. Non-work-related work. Fifth, even if you are lucky enough to get all the resources you needed to do your job, you are guaranteed to be interrupted with stuff that has nothing to do with your job. This is the potpourri of things such as continuing education/CPE, diversity/sensitivity/sexual harassment training, certifications, ISO 9000, Six Sigma, etc., charity/community/CSR and other non-work PR functions, and the biggest waste of time in all of corporate America, meetings. At one point in time, nearly 95% of an employee's time was spent working, perhaps spending that remaining 5% on bathroom breaks, coffee breaks, and cigarette breaks. It allowed you to get your work done, prove yourself, and maybe even get promoted. Now you're lucky if you can spend even half your time working, as boss boomers have instituted a whole new work environment where the ulterior focus is on politics, PR, virtue signaling, and faux certifications, instead of work, production, and getting the freaking job done. The Law of Boomer Techch. Finally, there is the Law of Boomer Techch. This inviolable law is very much like the weakest link rule, where a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. But instead of the weakest link being the lowest common denominator, it's your boss boomer, and his complete absence of technological skills. I don't do Excel. How do I print off this PDF file? I don't like this color on the chart. No, you can't work from home. How do I know you're working? What's digital marketing? We already run ads on the radio and the newspaper. Why do I want blue teeth? This wouldn't be so bad if it was just the boss boomers who didn't use the technology, but a mandatory second principle of the Law of Boomer Techch is if the boss boomer doesn't understand the technology, then absolutely nobody can use it. This cripples your ability to do your work, bring value to the company, and advance your career, because you are only permitted to operate at the slow and low speed and intelligence of your boomer boss. It also halts your ability to learn new technology and become proficient in it, stagnating your skill set. But above all else, it causes incredible headaches and confrontation with boss boomers who will throw 3-year-old temper tantrums simply because they're too lazy to learn new tech. In the end, the Law of Boomer Techch drives talented labor away to the few companies and bosses that actively embrace and employ new technology. Impossible to endure the environment. If the above wasn't enough to drive you mad, boss boomers had a full armory of passive-aggressive weapons they could use to make your employment a living hell. And while there were certainly boss boomers whose motives were malicious and evil, it seemed as if most boss boomers were more clueless, irrational, likely mentally ill, or even genuine sadists. Regardless, this gaping flaw in their mentality resulted in genuinely toxic environments that could only be described as abusive. So hostile, in fact, you'd often be forced to choose between making rent or maintaining your mental health, the better choice often being to quit and risk homelessness. But of all the passive-aggressive weapons in their arsenal, the most common among these tactics was micromanagement. Micromanagement. Like a mosquito flying around at night while you try to sleep, legions of boss boomers just could not let you be and work in peace. Every nook, cranny, word, and piece of work you'd produce would have to be hyperanalyzed, critiqued, and questioned by the armies of micromanaging bosses. And even if the end product was precisely what they wanted, if you didn't do it their way, which was incredibly inefficient, costly, pointless, and tedious, then it wasn't done right. No doubt many of you have suffered the anal retentive boss boomer who would obsess over your work, looking for any flaw they could possibly find. And you might ask what possible reason there would be for them to engage in such behavior. But while there is no logical or sane reason for them to micromanage you, there are two incredibly petty ones. They are threatened by you and your superior abilities, and they want to go on a power trip. No work is without its minor and consequential flaws. But in finding these minor irrelevant flaws and making a big deal of them, these psychopathic bosses perpetually put you on the defensive, lording your mistakes over you, making them feel superior. This also eliminated you, in their eyes anyway, as a threat to them, either because you were better at technology, had a better work ethic, or were just smarter than them, which is much more common than you think. All of this insanity simply to assuage their insecurities, and get them that endorphin rush that comes with a power trip. Unfortunately, power-tripping bosses destroy morale, destroy loyalty, and bring work to a screeching halt. They also create incredible employee turnover, as well as drive companies directly into bankruptcy. Thus, after quitting their jobs, many millennials and Gen Xers would find out later their old power-tripping boss boomers didn't last too long after they left. And oftentimes, neither did the company. Mentally ill bosses. Related to micromanagement are boss boomers who were genuinely mentally ill. This could be megalomaniacs, genuine sadists, bipolar bosses, clinical narcissists, or any other mentally disturbed boomer. Regardless of the actual mental illness, these boss boomers were universally solipsistic, only able to focus on and care about themselves. Neither you nor the real world mattered while you were under their employ. But even though they may have been your supervisor at the time, even the owner of the company, in the long run their mentality was simply not compatible with reality. And inevitably, they and their company would fail. These psychopathic bosses came to manifest only because temporary circumstances allowed them to temporarily exist. For example, the dot-com bubble was full of megalomaniac boss boomers who thought they were going to launch an IPO, become billionaires, and revolutionize the world. Elizabeth Holmes, though a Gen Xer, only kept her company Theranos afloat because of an affirmative action bubble in Silicon Valley. Bankster boomers could only make engineer money when the housing bubble padded their incomes with bloated commissions. Even an entrepreneur getting some venture capital or an all-star employee being promoted to executive is enough of an ego boost to blind these people to reality. And while these temporary bits of progress fooled these fools into thinking they were the center of the universe, they still insisted on making irrational demands on their employees because all they could think of was themselves. Working 90 hours a week, getting their laundry for them, babysitting their children, lying on financial statements, creating shell companies to raise additional funds, and forcing you to sit in front of hour-long bragging sessions disguised as speeches. But like micromanaging bosses, mentally ill ones do not last long because their decisions and themselves are not anchored in reality. They do not consider what other people want, let alone need, let alone are capable of. And their egos are often so big, financial reality doesn't even pierce their egotistical bubble. It's not until the money runs out and they are forced to declare bankruptcy that their delusion ends and they're forced to return to Earth. Therefore, it's guaranteed they and their companies will fail, but not without first taking a tremendous psychological toll on any employee unfortunate enough to have worked for them. And many millennials were precisely those employees. Contradictory orders. Then there are contradictory or outright impossible orders. If in a particularly high-stress environment or industry, or perhaps in simple recessionary times, certain boss boomers would frantically become like Hitler in his last days of World War II. They would give you orders that were simply not possible, or give you completely contradictory orders to the ones they gave you a few short minutes ago. A perfect example of this was from the prelude to the financial crisis. While working as an investment analyst, my job was to crunch numbers and financial statistics to assess whether certain bonds would be paid back. The job was purely mathematical. There was no opinion, editorializing, or gray areas. You took financial statements, plugged in the numbers, and a model would generate the results. But the amount of anger, rage, and lecturing I and other analysts would receive because the model didn't deliver the results the managers wanted was unfathomable. Despite the figures being indisputable, we would be yelled at, reprimanded, and told to do the job again, the only way of which would be to lie and fabricate the numbers, violating a slew of federal regulations and laws. It was quite literally like Hitler issuing orders to German army groups that no longer existed to repel the Russians from Berlin. Though that is a specific example during the worst financial crisis in the past 90 years, no doubt many millennials and Gen Xers have experienced the same delusion and impossibility of boss boomers. being given an order to fabricate your sales figures to raise money during the dot-com bubble, being tasked with achieving some kind of goal but with no budget or resources. A common one is being hired for one job and then having them completely repurpose you into another role, then frantically repurposing you for a third, as you are sent to put out the fire of a fourth. And how much do you want to bet the Wells Fargo fake account scandal was because a boss boomer set impossible sales quotas on their staff under threat of being fired if they didn't achieve them? Regardless of the scenario, issuing impossible or contradictory orders is precisely that, impossible. You cannot do it. And be you a millennial or Xer employee, the result was doomed to be the same. Getting yelled at, getting reprimanded, and/or getting fired. Once again, there is no love lost between the generations at the workplace. But when boss boomers forced this psychotic and delusional behavior on subordinates, all while threatening their employees' livelihoods with being fired, it's a perfectly reasonable reaction to intensely hate, loathe, and detest boss boomers. Eliminating meritocracy from the job. If by some miracle you were still hanging onto a job, either out of sheer desperation or financial necessity, boss boomers eliminated any fairness or meritocracy from the employment world. Favoritism, nepotism, and cronyism. First among these was the favoritism, nepotism, and cronyism that was rife among the boomer managerial classes. You might have 5 loyal years with a company, advanced CPE credits in every field they told you to study, and a habit of staying late and getting the job done. But if a frat buddy needed a job, or a buddy's daughter needed employment, it was not uncommon for boss boomers to pass you over for promotion and give it to a lesser qualified candidate. Affirmative action. This unfair practice was not only further ensconced in employer culture, but actually made official policy, specifically through affirmative action. Preferential hiring was always rampant in human resource departments, with a cabal of HR ladies often hiring people because they were BFFs and not hiring people because OMG Tina, his tie was hideous. But with affirmative action, boss boomers made it official policy to hire women and minorities at the expense of those who were not. Whatever noble aims affirmative action may have had, affirmative action was objectively bigoted, giving preferential treatment to people because of traits they were born with, not their abilities, accomplishments, or potential. This provided great disincentive to stick with a company long term, let alone try your best, because there was no guarantee your efforts would be recognized or rewarded. Additionally, this deterrence also limited the potential of millions of millennials whose cardinal sin was being born with the wrong plumbing or melanin levels. Health insurance. Health insurance is also a little-known but completely blatant and unmeritocratic money grab from millennials to boomers. At first you may think it's great your employer offers you insurance, and as a means to show you how much compensation they're giving you, employers will usually explicitly state how much they're paying you for your health insurance. This can vary, but usually it is around $400 a month. But if you are slightly savvy, you'll notice that you can probably get a lot cheaper health insurance privately. So you might ask your boss if they can just pay you the cash instead and have you go out and get insurance yourself. They will quickly and immediately deny your request. The reason why is that even though it really doesn't cost $400 a month to insure you, it does cost $800 a month to insure the obese employee boomers, and $1,500 a month to insure the Gen Xer family man with a wife and 3 kids. In short, when a company magnanimously offers you health insurance, they're more often than not charging you more than what you can get in the private market because they need your premiums to subsidize the insurance of both older boomers, obese boomers, and, admittedly, Gen X families. Lying about promotion. If you think you can make up for this extra tax through hard work, promotion, and pay raises, think again. Because boss boomers, despite promises otherwise, will never pay you what you're worth, promote you, or give you a raise unless absolutely forced to. This is in direct contradiction to what they told you when you were younger, that if you worked hard, put in your dues, and showed you were willing to go above and beyond the call of duty, you'd get recognized, promoted, and rewarded. And, of course, the laughable claim, employees are our best asset. The truth is, no boss boomer in the history of boomers ever rated an employee 5 or excellent in a performance review because they simply didn't want to pay the extra money even if they rightly deserved it. The only way you got a promotion and a pay raise out of a boss boomer was by going to work for the competition, threatening to leave, and playing hardball. Being nice, being a good employee, and playing by the rules simply did not work. Being indispensable, being disloyal, threatening to walk away, and being willing to do it was the only way to get promoted in Boomer world. Rescinding perks. Finally, boss boomers were notorious for reneging on perks they promised when you decided to come aboard. These perks likely swayed your decision to come work for them. The perks themselves may be so valuable they were the primary reason you decided to go with them and not another employer. But when boss boomers, for whatever reason, decided to rescind or renege these perks, it was nothing short of a lie, a betrayal, and an evil act, and one you had every right to sue over. The most epitomal example of this is telecommuting. There are several things that should no longer exist in today's world. Downtown skyscrapers, office buildings, metered ramps, traffic jams, and rush hour. And the reason these things should not exist is because we have had the internet, and thus the ability to do all office jobs from home, since 1998. The only and sole reason we are forced to waste trillions of human years jacking our cortisol levels and car insurance rates up, fighting through traffic twice a day, an hour each way, while our families are neglected at home, is because of the glacially stupid boss boomers and their infamous law of Boomer Techch. And despite having now 2 decades to learn and familiarize themselves with the powers of the internet, boss boomers across the nation always respond in unison when asked about telecommuting. But if I can't see you, how do I know you're working? That statement alone is responsible for more divorces, broken homes, heart attacks, strokes, higher taxes, car crashes, estranged children, cheating wives, philandering husbands, and psychologist visits than any single thing in the world. But all of that can be avoided if boss boomers simply let people work from home. Not only could all of that be avoided, but we could also save on gas, save 2 hours a day in free time, have a happier home, and drastically better mental and physical health. We could even usher in a truly new economic revolution that would increase standards of living on par with the Industrial Revolution if boss boomers would simply let people work from home. And some do. That is, until they don't and renege on that perk. Telecommuting is only the pinnacle example of a perk, as it can make all the difference in one's job, even life. And I only delved into it in such detail because it truly shows just how much boss boomers' ignorance has cost society. But other perks, such as flexible work schedules, windows in the office, good coffee, jeans at the office, even something as minor as headphones, can also make all the difference in the world to an employee. But to betray the trust of your employee simply because some other employees complained or you simply changed your mind is just yet another reason, of the many we've highlighted, where boss boomers have made traditional employment simply unacceptable to any normal, self-respecting person. The biggest lie ever. The employment and managerial methods of boss boomers were insulting, unacceptable, unethical, often illegal, and despicable. But to add insult to injury, boss boomers had one more trick up their sleeve. Anytime something went wrong, they had the ego and the arrogance to make it sound like it was your fault, that you were the one failing, that you were the one to blame for their incompetence, lies, and egomania, not them. This was more common than you think because things often went wrong when boss boomers were at the helm. Be it something as minor as high employee turnover at a single firm, or destroying the entire tech sector by financing the dot-com bubble, boss boomers' incompetence would lead to missed profits, missed sales goals, reprimands, layoffs, bankruptcies, federal penalties, stock market crashes, and even the entire global economy going into recession. But because boss boomers were at their core egotistical, their pride simply could not accept the fact that these things were their fault. And since it couldn't have been them who had the problem, it must have been somebody else. Namely, their then naive 22-year-old freshly graduated Millennial and Gen X employees. This was an absolutely maddening experience for any hard-working Millennial or Gen Xer unfortunate enough to work under one of these delusional boss boomers. The reason why is you would automatically defer to boss boomers because it logically made sense. They were your elders. They were the boss. They were 45 with gray hair and 20 years experience, and you were just an inexperienced 24-year-old know-nothing. In other words, boss boomers were infallible. Therefore, if something went wrong and your boss was mad, you must have done something wrong, and it was only you who was to blame. But in operating from this false premise, millions of millennials and Xers would misdiagnose the real problem, which was a recipe for going insane. You would futilely try to improve yourself by getting more training or perhaps a master's degree. You would change the chart color from gray to a slightly darker shade of gray, thinking that would make the boss less angry. True story. You'd think that you were a bad employee because your boss took away your earphone privileges. And you'd even fetch your psychopathic boss coffee, thinking that was your problem. Years, even decades, millennials and Gen Xers would spend trying to unlock the secret to professional and career success, desperately trying to figure out what they were doing wrong, when, in reality, there was absolutely nothing wrong with them. It was simple baby boomer ineptitude. Simple boss boomer incompetence. Simply weak, pathetic men. Like all deals with the devil, boss boomers would have to pay the price, as they could not keep up the charade forever. And there was a defining moment where they failed so spectacularly that the scales fell from the younger generation's eyes to see boss boomers for the weak, incompetent men they were. The financial crisis of 2008. The financial crisis of 2008 was so crushing it shocked people awake to see the boss boomers for what they were. A recession like that had not seen its equal in 30 years, nor its superior in 90. But what made it particularly jarring was its origins directly threatened the most important financial thing in people's livelihoods: their homes. Homes were repossessed, foreclosed upon, and families evicted. This gave Americans long pause to sit and think about how the Great Recession came about. But for younger people, it pierced the illusion of boss boomer superiority and infallibility. The boss boomers were squarely in command of the economy at that time, and it was their ineptitude, incompetence, and corruption that allowed the Great Recession to happen. And everybody could see it. Alas, the boss boomers were no longer infallible. They were, in fact, quite inferior. When you put the Great Recession in context of the education bubble, broken homes, divorce, single parenthood, unrepayable national debt, and the fact 2/3 of boomers hadn't saved enough for retirement, it became very apparent that the boomer generation in general had absolutely no freaking clue what it was doing. Your gut instincts were right all along about boss boomers. They were drunk at the wheel and should never have been listened to in the first place. But this doesn't make up for the years of torture you endured thinking there was something wrong with you and your career. And it doesn't make up for the incredible stress boss boomer incompetence caused, because it constantly threatened your job and thus your livelihood. But the good news is boss boomers are now a known quantity. They have been disgraced. They have been proven wrong. History will know this forever. And though confiscating their social security checks might sound a tempting form of compensation, a slight comfort might be knowing that they were so incompetent the simple hashtag #OKBoomer actually carries weight and intrinsic value. So much so, you can utter it and put an entire generation of ex-boss boomers in their place. The 1099 Superior Race. There is, however, a bit of good news from this disaster known as the boss boomers. In making it impossible to work with them, boss boomers, well, made it impossible. Sure, you might leap to another lily pad, hoping it would be at least tolerable, but what you'd find is you were just jumping from one frying pan into another. There was never going to be a sane, stable, long-term job. But with the advent of the internet and, curiously enough, Obamacare, millennials were given a reprieve from traditional employment, and the boss boomers who ruined it. The internet essentially allowed millennials to bypass boss boomers in a myriad of key ways. First, you no longer needed a third-party employer to offer your labor and skills to a client. You could just go online, set up a website or a profile, find a client who needed some work done, and directly apply to them. No HR dits, no boss boomer, no master's degree preferred. Second, you could work for anybody, doing anything. You were no longer relegated to employers within a 50-mile radius of your house, nor were you relegated to being an accountant or a carpenter. Be it bookkeeping, consulting, coding, even babysitting, if you could do it, you could make money on it online. You didn't need permission from some gatekeeping boss boomer to be successful. Finally, you could do your job how you saw fit, not the inefficient, handicapped way boss boomers demanded. This allowed you to be as efficient as possible, realizing your full potential and keeping the maximum share of profits for yourself. In short, the internet allowed you to become a hired gun to the world, a company of one, aka an independent contractor, and nobody could stop you. This was good news because contributing to this labor market revolution at the same time was Obamacare. Whatever its good intentions, Obamacare drastically increased the cost of health insurance for everyone, including employers. To avoid paying this increased expense, employers either scaled their employees' hours down to 29.5 hours, making them part-time, or would simply not hire people, contracting out their work instead. This resulted in the gig economy, where people would have to work multiple jobs just to make a living. Worse, since they had no single reliable employer, people would have to buy their own health insurance privately. But while the gig economy may have sounded like a bad deal, in reality, Obamacare and the gig economy was a blessing in disguise, because it drove demand up for independent contractors. It not only commoditized labor, but normalized independent contract work as opposed to predispositioning people into mandatory 9-to-5 traditional boss boomer work. This pushed everyone to become a 1099 contractor rather than a W-2 employee. A hired gun versus a wage slave. A company of one versus a worker drone. In other words, entrepreneurs versus corporate cogs. This is the lemonade made from the lemons of boss boomers. In making traditional employment impossible, boss boomers essentially forced younger generations to seek other forms of employment, namely self-employment. And while at first glance the gig economy seems like a raw deal, it is in fact drastically superior to traditional W-2 boomer employment. You get a high hourly wage in that there's no third-party employer taking their cut to fund your boss boomer's salary. You have a diversified client base where you rely on no one gig, so no one individual boss can threaten your entire income stream. You also have a diversified skill set which inoculates you against recession. Health insurance is cheaper since you are insuring only yourself as opposed to subsidizing obese, unhealthy boomer employees at a corporate gig. And you will never have to hear, "If I can't see you, how do I know you're working?" This has resulted in one of the rare bright spots of the millennial generation. Millennials are effectively a generation of micro-entrepreneurs, nomadic coders, programming code while sitting on a Thai beach. Parents who can stay at home and watch over their kids as they contract out as a one-man call center. They can drive Uber or Lyft if times get desperate. And the thousands of brew pubs dotting the nation were no doubt started by millennials who had their fill of boomer bosses. Boss boomers may have been an absolutely loathsome lot, but they made traditional employment so bad it made entrepreneurship a much better alternative. Without them, we would have never had the incentive to leave the corporate world.